Thanks. Yeah, so there's already a lot going on, and just in that title, it's yeah. And I won't wait for people to come in; they can just sort of mill in, I suppose. But yeah, so today I want to talk a little bit more about the ways in which space is characterized in sort of a number of conservation initiatives and in a number of corners in Bhutan. And I know there's a lot of literature out there on sort of the differences between place and space literature, I think, has a lot that it can offer in these contexts. But I'm specifically going to be talking about space, and that's kind of the term that I'm going to be using throughout this presentation, and different ways in which groups and people think about space and then choose how to represent that space in the form of maps or in bounding sort of protected areas. And you know, this will gain clarity sort of during my presentation, but just as sort of a general bit of knowledge, Bhutan is a place where there are a lot of local deities as well as sort of the larger pantheon of Himalayan Buddhist of figures and teachers, and so I will talk a little bit more about that. And just to give sort of a blueprint of what I'll be talking about, you can sort of consider it to be in three parts. So I'm going to be providing a little bit of background and context to where I have been working, and some of my continued project work with an NGO called the Royal Society for Protection of Nature, which is an environmental conservation organization in Bhutan, who I've been working with since 2014. And then I'll talk, well, the numbering's weird there. So about these deity realms and how you can have these different spaces where different local deities have varying degrees of autonomy over like certain elements of the landscape, and discuss that as in the sort of larger context of spiritual landscapes and sacred space in the eastern Himalayas. And then specifically I'll be talking more about these different layers of sacredness, these different layers of sort of landscape values, and we'll be talking about that through the proxies of people, human communities, to specific bird species that are found in Bhutan and beyond, and then to the proxies of sort of mapping technologies and tools, and how that space is represented. And I'll bring that sort of all together and talk about the ways in which I'm sort of using icon as a lens with which to view these themes and ideas. So, first of all, just a little, oftentimes when I say Bhutan, people are like, oh, you mean Burma? And I'm like, no, Bhutan, it's a small kingdom sandwiched in between India and China. It's about the size of Switzerland or about the size of Pennsylvania, but with the Himalayas in the north and the lowlands in the south, there's a great diversity of topography and therefore plant, animal, human communities that can be found there. So this past summer was, as I said, sort of a continuation of some project work that I've been engaged in with the Royal Society for Protection of Nature, and part of this summer was sort of more of a collaborative mapping endeavor that we wanted to employ to sort of gather and garner more community input in how different spaces for this critically endangered white-bellied heron are represented in conservation maps or in education and outreach materials that RSPN produces. And one of the ways that we decided to do that was print out these large satellite imagery maps of different river confluences where these heron species can be found, and then sitting down with members of this group called the Local Conservation Support Group. So different community members who have been involved in this project for a long time, and they are sort of considered to be the heron guardians in some of these areas, and they're responsible for participating in monitoring initiatives for these herons. They have data sheets that they fill out when they view herons, when they see herons, what they see them doing. Sort of citizen science gathered data on this species. And so one of the things that was interesting and sort of emerged from this project were just things I hadn't considered before. So the idea with this was to use these different coding tags to identify, these orange are like place names or notable spaces that people identified. Green are more ecological features or agricultural features that people value. And then these pink tags were areas of disturbance or perceived threats to humans. And then some of these smaller tags were more specifically geared towards past sightings of white-bellied herons, specific threats to herons. And what was really interesting and what sort of evolved from what began as sort of a citizen science entry into thinking about valuable spaces for white-bellied herons were these conversations I had with people and foresters and rural fishermen who were talking about these spaces where local deities resided and areas where rituals were performed to sort of placate some of these local deities who can have benevolent and malevolent intentions. And that wasn't really a part of this process, but it was a conversation that we continued to have, and so it sort of redirected my research interests and made me think differently about how people are valuing certain spaces and valuing different elements on the landscape, in ways that are maybe specifically parallel to conservation values, but also maybe not. Maybe sort of like the incommensurate tensions between deity space, like autonomous deity space, and conservation spaces, that we're drawing all these maps on these, or drawing all these lines on these maps that maybe different things can be bounded in different ways. So that's just sort of the background of what I was up to this summer and how it sort of led me into thinking about these different layers of sacredness in Bhutan. So first, I want to expand a little bit more on what I mean when I'm talking about deity space and local deity realms. All of these things are pretty loaded terms. So in Bhutan, there are a lot of spaces that there's a lot of religious and spiritual history in these places, and monasteries like this just north of Thimphu, called Tango Gompa, is a monastery that was built on a specific site that is believed to have been visited by one of the primary teachers, in the 8th century in Bhutan, sort of a teacher who came in and is widely considered to be sort of the second Buddha. So because this teacher visited all these spaces and these certain places, these areas have that kind of spiritual value, and so monuments and temples are built in these spaces for particular reasons. There are other monuments or chortens, stupas, that are also sort of large edifices that mark these places, and this is a gathering of people receiving blessings from reincarnated beings. And if I can show a video, I'll see if it worked, which it didn't. And this just kind of gives us a more general idea. So, we have these large edifices, these monasteries, or these stupas or monuments that mark these spaces. But traveling through this landscape, you come across all kinds of different smaller spaces, boulders even, that are marked with actual, what are considered to be like physical markings of this teacher that has visited this space. So this is the second Buddha, Guru Rinpoche, and it's widely considered that this is a marking that was made by that teacher and a place that is now imbued with sort of this spiritual sacred energy. So these are little sort of stupa representations that are often actually made from the ashes of relatives, deceased relatives. And so these are placed there for particular reasons. And these are other examples of smaller sites, areas that are marked or identified in certain ways. And it may be that, there are different local deities that reside in these landscapes, and this is sort of a marking for that. This is sort of another representation of how sort of these lesser deities sort of reside within particular places on the landscape. And this is just another example of sort of this history of religion being inscribed in the landscape. So this is a depiction of a regional demoness that is considered to be detained by this complex of 13 temples that can be found in parts of China and Tibet, and then there are 2 temples in Bhutan as well. And so this is just an example of really how religion is very deeply inscribed in the landscape, and there are different rituals and festivals that are performed to sort of placate some of these deities. This is a festival at Seichu in Thimphu that is considered to be sort of a ritual event in honor of 2 local deities, Yeshi Gompa and Yeshi Gompa and Palden Lamo, which often these places, these areas are actually termed the name of the deity themselves. So how does this relate to herons? How does this relate to sort of the work that I completed in the summer? And in some ways, it doesn't really relate specifically to the heron, but what I think is interesting is thinking about how different spaces and areas are valued. So when you're talking about a bird like the critically endangered white-bellied heron, or like black-necked cranes, which I'll talk about in a little bit, we have these areas that are mapped and valued in certain ways. These are presence and nesting sites for white-bellied herons, and engaging in sort of mapping tools for this organization. We're designated, we're bounding these spaces that are often talked about in the context of these projects as heron's space. And so when we were talking with community members, the rhetoric and the language that a lot of the project officers use is that these rivers are like the heron's rivers, or that the fish within the river are a heron's fish. And so I think this sort of just broadens this narrative that different spaces have value for different reasons, and some of them have value at an institutional level because there are these species like the white-bellied heron or the black-necked crane, which are often considered to be sort of sacred spiritual birds, and there are festivals that celebrate these birds every year. I helped make this map of an area that black-necked cranes use, and sort of different areas and why they have value. So there are so many different ways of thinking about space, right? And there are even more ways of representing that space, and maps are one of them. You can have sort of artistic depictions of wildlife and homes, and represent space that way. With a conservation institution like the Royal Society for Protection of Nature, they're more interested in identifying like these hot spots of areas that are critical for white-bellied herons. And so what I'm sort of grappling with now and thinking through is how to go about understanding how community members can be more involved in identifying, not just spaces for herons, but articulating why they value landscapes for particular reasons, why they might ascribe a certain region as being deity's space, not just heron's space, and thinking about different tools and ways in which to integrate some of these ways in which we choose to represent space and map space. There's one of there's a suggestion out there recently of instead of thinking about like bounding sacred deity space with a polygon, to sort of use something that is often talked about in these regions of mandalas. And so someone had been talking to me about the idea of using mapping technologies to like place mandalas around these areas and sacred sites where you can find local deities, and it's this idea of kind of a central radiation of like spiritual power from the center that radiates out and is less bounded. And I think that's one of the things that I considered a lot, is sometimes these different values that we have are differentially capable of being bounded. We have like a space that can be like a home range that a bird might use, and bounding a space like that is full of all kinds of choices and biases, but bounding a space where a local deity resides may or may not be, possible. And I think navigating that the knowledge that exists in these communities about these local deity spaces will also be really interesting. What sort of knowledge am I privileged to? And what sort of knowledge am I not privileged to? And all of these kinds of considerations as well. But I think at a larger, sort of broader scale, what I find really interesting is thinking about ways in which to sort of investigate these dimensions through the lens of ICON, sort of approaching things through different disciplinary perspectives, talking about spatial analysis on one hand and talking about institutional ethnography on the other. My spending time with people who work in this institution, how they're characterizing and valuing spaces as opposed to how a critical geographer might value a space or a fisherman might value a space. And I think doing that in that way can be valuable at a program and academic level, and institutionally valuable as well for organizations that really are trying to merge these tools that we have to engage with communities and sort of prioritize their values perhaps over our own. And just as I know I don't have any more time, this is a really short video, but this just sort of, and this is a bad video, but it might give you a better idea of why people hold these birds in such high regard. So these are black-necked cranes in Pobjika dancing with each other, sort of a courting ritual. And with that, thank you all so much for your time.